quickly, but and you can ask questions at the end, that would be fine. I believe that in order to successfully adjust the hydraulic gearbox, that you need to understand how it works and what the theory that it works on. So I'm going to start by a little bit of history, and then I'm going to talk about how it compares to a manual gearbox, then I'm going to talk about the logic flow that it uses to operate the clutch, then I'm going to talk about the different components involved in the system, and then we'll actually do an adjustment of the car. So the first thing is, how many people here drive or have driven a Citromatic? Okay, so if you have, then this is sometimes familiar. If you haven't, then hopefully you'll learn something. For some it might go too fast, for some it'll go too slow. So the big deal is, okay, so how many people have driven a manual transmission, just a regular old car? Okay, everybody's done that. How many have driven a manual transmission from an old car, like 60s or earlier? Okay, so you'll recognize that with a manual transmission, it's a fair amount of work. You have to push on the clutch and shift the gears and push on the clutch and shift the gears, and you're just getting up to freeway speeds or driving in stop and go traffic. It's a lot of work. So automotive manufacturers for years have been thinking, what can we do to make it easier for people to drive the car? So the first thing that happened was they had powered shifting. The car would shift the gears with power, but you still had to use the clutch to start and stop the car. So that was kind of an early semi-automatic. And the first fully automatic gearbox was GM's Hydromatic in 1940. It was a 4-speed gearbox. But in general, because of the technology of the day, the automatic transmissions had some serious disadvantages compared to manual gearbox. Primarily, they were more expensive. They were less efficient because they used a fluid coupling. And mostly the part that I found most annoying is that you had less control over what the car did. The transmission decided. They were fine on flat ground if you were driving on a mountain road or downhill or towing a trailer. You didn't have a lot of choice. The Hydromatic was a 4-speed box, but yet the only choices you as a driver had were D and L. You didn't get much choice. By 1965, manufacturers said, okay, we're going to do D, S, and L. You had 3 choices. So, let's see, I got it. So now we're going to jump ahead to the 1950s, it's the jet age. Am I standing in your way? Okay. We're going to jump ahead to the 1950s, it's the jet age. Refrigerators were shaped like rocket ships. Some refrigerators even had, tail fins, you can see at the bottom. And the 11-speed, push button shifting was introduced by Chrysler in 1956. You just push the button. That's the era that we're talking about. The traction was 20 years old by this time, a little more than. And the Citroen DS was introduced at the Paris Auto Show in 1955 for the 56 model year. So Citroen, for their new model, they wanted effortless shifting. They wanted something, they wanted to give the people what everybody wanted, but they didn't want the disadvantages of less efficiency and less control. So what did they do? They came up with to retain control. They let the driver select what gear they were in, but they did it with powered shifting. So instead of moving the shift lever, you just touch the little lever here and you're in gear. So they did that, so you retained control, but it was effortless. And they made the clutch control fully automated. There was no clutch pedal. And so, okay, I was just going to start a little sideline. The factory designation is BBH for the Citromatic, which is Boîte Vitesse Hydraulique, and then the manual one is BBM for Boîte Vitesse Manuelle. Okay, so that's our little history lesson. So moving on. Okay, that's a little bit premature on that slide, but so moving on, what is the Citromatic? Well, it's a manual gear train, complete manual gear train, dry clutch, manual transmission, but it's hydraulically actuated and it's fully automatic clutch control. Conceptually, it's identical to the modern paddle shifting that you see on race cars. That first modern iteration of the BBH was introduced by Ferrari in 1989 on their F1 cars. It's just another example of Citroen being years ahead of everybody else. Now, some modern cars that have paddle shifting are not really the same as the Citromatic because it's just all electronic fluid coupled clutch. But the early F1s and stuff, they were exactly the same. Dry clutch, manual gearbox, selected now electronically, but the concept that Citroen developed in '55 is today common on modern cars. Okay, now, by eliminating all that stuff, Citroen truly developed driving with the hand and eye, which you can hardly see as their little advertising emblem down there of the driving hands with the Citromatic shift. So, probably due to the French tradition of frugality, there's many instances of parts repurposing in Citroen vehicles. For instance, the SM fuel filter is held in place with 2CD seat rubbers. The H-van is a particularly good example of this because it uses 15C brakes and door handles. It uses 2CD headlights. It uses the engine from the 11CV. Later it used the engine from the DS 63. And they ran that same 63 DS engine until 1981 when they finished the run. So in that spirit, Citroen, here's the H-van that you can see. In that spirit, what they did to develop the engine was they used an 11CV gearbox and clutch system, modernized it and modified it for the DS, and came out with the BBH system. So what they did is they added hydraulically actuated shift forks and they added a hydraulically actuated clutch slave. So, sorry, I'll turn that on first. So the full complement of parts that are required to make the Citromatic operate is this device, which is the shift block, and this device, which is the centrifugal regulator, this device, which is the clutch lockout control based on the gearbox, this device, which is the reengagement control, which controls the rate of change, this device, which is the accelerated idle device, which on this one you can see is where the engagement control goes. And this device, which is the top of the gearbox cover. And this device, which is the clutch spring, which actuates the clutch fork. Now, if you have a car with a manual transmission, you don't need any of these things. So, while the Citromatic is the ultimate expression of Citroen, it is more complicated, and I can't lie to you that it's not a more complicated system. There's more things to go wrong. But it's phenomenal, and I think it's a great deal. Okay, so now, to drive the Citromatic, you need to understand how a manual gearbox works. So let's just review the steps that you go through when you, I got a better slide here. Let's just review the steps that you go through when you drive a manual transmission. You're sitting at a stop, you put your foot on the brake, you put your foot on the clutch, you select the gear. Now comes the tricky part, you're getting into the gear engagement phase. You release the clutch quickly until you reach friction point. At that point, you moderate the clutch in the accelerator, you move between the throttle and the clutch, and the car smoothly leaves. Now the clutch is fully engaged. The advantage to this over an automatic is you can adjust that interplay. You can ease the clutch out and ease on the gas and take off gently. Or you can rev it up and pop the clutch and squeak the tires and take off quickly. It was difficult to do that with an automatic in 1950. They just didn't really do that as well. So now that's the next step you got to understand is now you're moving down the road, you're going to go between gears. Between gears, you put your foot on the clutch, you select the lever, you let the clutch out, you do the same thing. You bring it to friction point quickly, then you moderate the throttle and the clutch and let it out. That's manual gearbox. Now, the main difference between a fully automatic gearbox and the Citromatic, the BBH, is the throttle control. In the automatic, you just put it in gear and step on the gas and away you go. The Citromatic, when you shift gears, you have to actually continue to use the throttle as if you're driving a manual transmission because you actually are. You still have to follow that format. So just to quickly review driving the Citromatic, you would do the same thing. You would, if you move the lever too quickly, then the engine revs up because you forgot to take your foot off the gas. If you do it too slowly, the car slows down because you didn't do it long enough. So the deal is, even if you know how to drive a manual transmission, there is a learning curve to Citromatic because when you're driving a manual transmission, the interplay is between your clutch foot and your throttle foot. You let the clutch off, you put the gas down, you move your 2 feet together, and that's how you control how the car drives. In a Citromatic, there's no clutch pedal. So that same interplay
is between your hand moving the shift lever and your throttle foot. So it's the same exact thing, except it's a different part of your body that's doing the work. So it takes a while to get used to, oh, my clutch is not working with the throttle, my hand is. Once you get that, it's easy to drive the car, because it's exactly the same as a manual, because it is. Okay. Now, we're going to talk about the logic of the system. This is where you get into how to adjust it. So, a standard computer process can be looked at like this. Any computer can be dropped into these categories. Basically, what a computer does is looks at data, it makes a choice, and it returns a result. So, in the computer parlance, it would be input, process, and output. In the automotive industry, we say sense, decide, and actuate, because automotive computers cause something to happen, they actuate something. In our case, the data input for our computer, the shift block here, is in fact a simplified logic block. We have the manual clutch release lever, that's here. A lot of people don't even know this lever exists. It sits under the dash pod. Here's the steering wheel, it's right under here. You have the manual clutch control lever. You have the gear selector lever, that's another input. You have your brake status, whether the brakes are on or off. You have the RPM of the engine, that's this device over here, the central regulator tells the logic block what the RPM of the engine is. You have the gearbox status, whether you're engaged in first or second gear or not engaged in first and second gear. You have the throttle position, which is this device here, and you have the throttle rate of change, which is also this device. So in our system, with the exception of the brake control and accelerated idle device, the only results that this computer outputs are clutch on or clutch off. That's the only choices it makes. However, you can vary the rate at which that change occurs. It's not necessarily on or off, it's on or on. It's variable, but the two choices are on or off for the clutch. And because it's a hydraulic computer, the clutch slave is actuated with hydraulic pressure. The output is a hydraulic signal. When the hydraulic clutch slave is pressurized, it pushes on the clutch fork just like when you push your foot on the clutch, it's pressurizing the cylinder. So think push pressure, it's the same. When the system releases the pressure in the clutch slave, it's like taking your foot off the clutch and the clutch engages. So it's very analogous to what you would actually do when you drove the car. So the next step, whoa, went too far. Went way too far. Okay, we'll get back to where I thought I was. There. Oh. All right, we'll get back here pretty soon. There, okay. So I'm going to start by using electrical analogies to explain logic circuits. So there's two basic types of electrical circuits. You have series circuits and parallel circuits. In this circuit, you can see, whoops, that's the series parallel. Whoops, sorry, there we go, right? There, that's it. Okay. You can see in this one, if you want the light to go on, both this switch, and this switch all have to be on for the light to turn on. So what we essentially have is an AND logic gate. A is true, B is true, and C is true, then the light is on, which means the light is true. You can also have a parallel circuit, which is an OR circuit. In other words, if either switch E or switch F is on, then the light goes on. So now I have the two simple logic choices, AND and OR. Now we move to the diagram, whoops. And you can also have a combination circuit, which is a blend of series circuits and parallel circuits. You have a hybrid parallel series circuit, which is what the test is the combination circuit. Now we move to the logic diagram of how the system works. You got to understand that this is not the way the pipes in the car are routed. This is a hypothetical logic flow diagram of how the system works. So it's not how they plumbed it in the car. So, just to make sure I don't forget anything here. Okay. So, this is not an electrical system, this is a hydraulic system. So the nodes, these circles, represent hydraulic valves, not switches. And in our circuit, we have three valves that are OR circuits, three OR valves. And we have two AND valves. The OR valves are the clutch control cylinder, the clutch release valve, and the centrifugal regulator. The hand valves are the clutch reengagement control and the lockout device. In this diagram, you can see barely that there's a square around here. The two valves in the square are contained within the shift block. The other valves are in these external components here. So now we got to take a little side trip. How does a hydraulic valve work? All the valves, pretty much all the valves in the D series are of this nature. They're a hydraulic spool valve. And the piston is precisely fit in the bore, typically a several micron clearance. For perspective, one of your pairs is about 50 microns. So they're pretty tightly machined. And Citroen had an amazing manufacturing facility. Even in the 60s, they can turn out thousands of these highly precision parts every day. So the way the valve works, this valve in particular is an OR valve. And you can see that there's a wide part of the piston sliding in the bore, just like this, and a narrow part. So in this case, the fluid can't get in or out of here because the piston is blocking off the port. In the cylinder, there's a hole drilled into the port. So it blocks the fluid off. If I were to move the piston up, it would expose this port to this port. The fluid would flow around the narrow part of the valve and through. That's a slide valve. That's an OR valve. They use them in the steering, in the height correctors, everywhere in the car. This valve, which is the schematic representation of this valve, is an AND valve because it only has two positions. Either the fluid flows through and it's in its open position now, and you can see if I were to move the piston up, it would block off this port and the fluid would be able to flow. So that's an example of an AND valve. In any case, they're spool valves. Okay, so back to logic. How do we understand that? Okay, it seems like I'm forgetting something here. I did forget something, but I know I did. Well, I'm not sure where I put it, and I forgot, so I'll just say what it is. At any rate, the deal, I'd like to find that missing page. Hang on just a second. Oh, well, I guess I didn't miss it. Okay, what I was going to say is, unlike an electrical circuit, hydraulic valves, an electrical switch can either be on or off, but a hydraulic valve has several options. One of the differences, the hydraulic valve is bidirectional. Fluid can flow in, or in other words, it can flow either way through the valve, so they're bidirectional. The other difference is that, well, I don't know, I thought I wrote this down somewhere. Oh, there it is, yeah. So there's three possible states that the hydraulic valve can exist in. It can allow pressure to flow through. In other words, pressure can come into it, pressure can go out of it, but the most important thing is that it can hold pressure. In other words, if you pressurize this device here and this valve is closed, the pressure stays in there, just like this device. I pre-charge this and nothing's happening, but yet it's holding 500 pounds. If I click the lever, it's actually going to actuate the slave because the pressure is stored in there. The valve is not letting the pressure back out again. And that's essential to understand how the hydraulic system works, is you have the three states that the pressure can go through the valve one way, through the valve the other way, or it can hold the pressure in the component that we're talking about, which in this case would be the clutch slave cylinder. Okay, so now back to the logic diagram. There's two main branches to the logic tree. The primary root control is the clutch release valve, which is this valve here. When this valve is pulled out like this and you can push the little lever up and lock it in that release position, that turns off the hydraulic pressure to the entire system, to the shift selector fork, to the clutch slave. It just releases all the hydraulic pressure from everything, except as we talked earlier. And you use that if you want to crank start the car or service the car. It's primarily a service and position to crank start the car, because if you've got the car, well, we'll get to that a little later, but whenever the car is in neutral, the clutch is completely disengaged, absolutely. So now you want to crank start the car, but you can't because the crank won't turn it because the clutch is disengaged. There's no way for the crank to connect to the engine because the clutch is disengaged. So you push this little lever in, releases all the pressure, the clutch is engaged, now you can crank start the car. Which is important then to note where the selector lever is when you crank start the car, because if you happen to have left it in first gear and you crank the car up and you go vroom and the car takes off down the road. I've had that happen to me, unfortunately. I was under the hood. And anyway, so you want to be very careful where the selector lever is when you're operating the car, even if you're crank starting it from under the hood with the solenoid button. You want to make sure where that shift lever is before you start the car. Okay. So we've got the two main branches of the tree. So the primary one we just talked about is the clutch release valve. Now, in normal position, it's pressurized. And this is the shift pattern for the Citromatic. And the other branch of the circuit, or rather I should say the top branch, the N branch, the neutral branch, whenever the lever is anywhere in neutral or anywhere between any of the other points, anywhere in here, the car is in neutral. It doesn't have to be in neutral to be in neutral. Whenever the circuit, or whenever the selector is not in one of the detents, it automatically shifts the logic block to this path here. And in that path, the high pressure comes in. The OR valve is set this way. I have a diagram for that. Normal state of the car. If you release the clutch lever, it does this. It takes the pressure, turns it off to the rest of the system, and releases it to the exhaust. That's the clutch release lever. Under normal circumstances, it's like this. The high pressure comes in through the manual valve, it goes through the clutch control valve, which is in the shift block, and it shunts the pressure into the clutch slave. So whenever you're not in gear, the full pressure that's regulated internally to the shift block goes to the clutch slave. Somewhere around 700 or more PSI it takes to operate the clutch slave. Now, whenever you're not in a neutral position, the only other choice we have in the logic tree is if you're actually selected a gear. If the detent is in one of the little notches, whenever you're in a gear selected position, the clutch control valve selects the other path of the logic, and now you're into the series circuit. The fluid can, this is again where it's a logic, not the actual piping. When the fluid's flowing this direction, there's no restriction. You're in gear, but you're not accelerating, you're not doing anything. The high pressure is going to go directly to the clutch slave. The clutch is going to be fully disengaged. Now, at this point, in order for the pressure to get back out, because remember valve's hold pressure, it's going to have to go through this valve, and this valve in order for the pressure to release out of the clutch slave. This is the magic of the automatic clutch control system. So now we're going to take another little side trip and we're going to talk about how this system relates to the manual gearbox. So we're going to pretend we're driving the manual gearbox again, but we're going to instead overlay what the automated system is doing to duplicate that. So we're sitting in our Citromatic, our BGH, and we've got our foot on the brake, and we're going to select the gear, first gear in this case, and then we're going to release our foot off the brake. Well, the first thing that happens is the accelerated idle device on the carburetor moves it from base idle up to accelerated idle. And we'll talk about more of this later, but this device, the centrifugal regulator, is this valve here. And it's RPM sensitive. So at a certain RPM that you set with that device, it releases its pressure. And it turns to this. Now we've got the flow going back this way. So the first link in our chain of release has moved to exhaust, because as we take our foot off the gas, the accelerated idle boosts the idle RPM, which crosses the threshold of pressure release in the centrifugal regulator, which opens the central regulator to exhaust. So now we're 1/3 of the way towards letting the clutch off. The second thing that happens is when you take your foot off the brake, there's a brake override device inside there, which we'll see later, which whenever you apply the brakes, it makes it much less likely for the clutch to engage. And so that's released. So now you've released the clutch override, you've crossed the threshold of release, so the centrifugal regulator is no longer holding pressure in the system. The clutch lockout device is no longer holding pressure in the system because the act of selecting the gear and having the gearbox top move the selector fork has opened that circuit. So now the only thing left that's holding the pressure into the clutch slave is the clutch re-engagement control. And the clutch re-engagement control is this one, and it's connected to your accelerator linkage. And one of the ways that it's designed, which we'll get to later, is when it sees that the pressure applied through it, because the pressure to get to the clutch slave has to go through it, when it sees that applied pressure drop, it immediately drops part of its pressure. It lets part of the pressure through, which brings the clutch to friction point right away, very quickly, just like you would do with your foot. Then as soon as that happens, the car, if you were just sitting in idle, would start to creep a little bit. Now the clutch is at friction point, you step on the gas, and the re-engagement control determines the rate between the interplay between the throttle and the clutch release. And it allows you to either accelerate quickly by stepping on the gas or accelerate slowly by easing on the gas. And if your Citromatic is properly set up, you should be able to ease away from the curb or squeak the tires by stepping on the gas. If it's properly adjusted, you should be able to do anywhere in between those two things. So now we're going to move to the, we're already driving down the road, shift gears phase. We release the throttle and deselect the gear simultaneously. Now you're in neutral. We shift back to the N branch on the top. It fully disengages the clutch. We move the selector lever to the selected gear. But we're already above idle. We already don't have the brakes on. So the centrifugal regulator has already released its pressure. We're in gear, so the lockout is already out. So now the only thing at this point that's holding the pressure in is the re-engagement control. And it's already above idle, so the release of the regulator has already occurred. So we're already at friction point. So all you do is step on the gas and go. So that overlays what's happening inside with the manual gearbox. So now, we'll talk a little bit about the individual components. So the first component is the shift block. That's this guy here. And it's basically, it's orchestrating the logic. It's orchestrating where the fluid goes. It's our logic controller. So it's a little hard to see in this picture, and there's diagrams that we can look at later when this is in this particular case, I've not colored the whole thing in because it's complicated, but the high pressure comes in here, and it goes through this section. I forgot to mention in the beginning that this little talk is primarily aimed at BPH cars after 1966 model year. Well, I wrote it down somewhere, but in here, the earlier cars, like 61 and earlier, or between 61 and 66, were essentially the same, but the re-engagement control is different. Before that, they didn't have a centrifugal regulator. They used a hydraulic pump on the water pump to detect the RPM of the engine because the water pump drives off the camshaft, and they can use that by the faster the engine goes, the more hydraulic pressure built up, and they use that change in hydraulic pressure from the low pressure pump to determine the RPM of the engine to adjust the clutch control. And that's what this empty space here is in the shift block. This portion right here, if you take one of these apart, there's a big old empty space in there that like, what is that for? Well, it's left over from then, but it's, you know, even though it was 20 years, it didn't matter. They already built that part and it was working fine, and they just took the guts out and didn't worry about it. But it's a legacy from the early cars. So that's why it goes over there. So anyway, the hydraulic fluid, the high pressure is listed in blue. This device here is the clutch control piston. That's the clutch control spool valve that lives in there. And if you go back to our diagram, that was the primary OR valve in the system. In this case, the OR valve is set so that, and the brown line here, this is the connection to the centrifugal regulator. Remember, that's the first leg in our three-part release section. So the clutch control valve has blocked the pressure to the regulator. It's opened the pressure to high pressure, so high pressure goes directly to the clutch slave. That's the OR position of the valve. That's the top half of the logic circuit. So the clutch control valve does that. Now the next slide is going to show the same shift block, but in fourth gear instead of neutral. Now in fourth gear, you can see it changes. I've filled in a little more fluid because the high pressure comes in and the high pressure has energized the central device here. This is the fairly sophisticated clutch or gear selector deal because it both rotates and moves in and out, but it's still a spool valve at heart. It's still a spool valve. And it has holes bored in, and there's a hole for each gear. And as you move the valve up and down, it lines the high pressure up, which comes out the middle in this case, to the different gears. So in this case, it's fourth gear. The high pressure comes in, it's selected out here, it goes down to the fourth gear clutch slave or gearbox slave, and you've selected fourth gear. But it's a little more complicated than that because you have two other things going on here. You have this stack of pucks, I call them pucks, and these have O-rings around them, and then you have this stack of little pucks here. These little pucks are stacked up against the spool valve that is the clutch control valve, which is pressurized with the spring. These little pucks are lined up against this spring. So what happens is a several stage process. In this process of the three things that happen, well first, these are the three things that happen. The clutch slave will engage, the pucks will push apart, and then pressure will become equalized. In that sequence of three things, the one that takes the least amount of pressure is energizing the slave top in the gearbox. The thing that takes the next amount of pressure is pushing these pucks apart against this spring. So why are these here? Well, if you move the shift lever too fast, if you move the clutch fork too fast inside the gearbox, you run the risk of grinding the gears. So they needed a way to slow it down a little bit so the engagers had a time to engage the synchros and move smoothly in. So this is the synchro mesh dash pots that release or dampen the pressure. They're shock absorbers. So the first thing that happens is the high pressure comes through and you select the gear. It starts to move the fork inside the gearbox. And as the fork starts to move, it also simultaneously starts to push these pistons apart against that spring, and the spring kind of acts as a cushion. And eventually these push fully apart, can't go apart anymore, and that cushioning effect has occurred. Once that happens, it continues the pressure buildup in the system, which is enough to engage the clutch fork completely. And the final thing that happens is these little pucks get pushed apart against this spring pressure, which in turn pushes up the valve, which opens it to the centrifugal regulator and closes it off to high pressure. So now we've effectively gone from the top bar in the logic block to the bottom one. Now we're back to our release scenario. So that's what the shift block does. Moving to the next one, our centrifugal regulator, that's this device here. This is the first of the release units in our three-part thing. And starting at the right here, well, let's start in the middle. This is the OR valve from the centrifugal regulator here, and the clutch slave is the middle port, and you can see the fat part of the piston there, and the two skinny parts of the piston there. So if I move the piston to this direction, it's going to open the clutch slave to high pressure, because the high pressure can also come through the centrifugal regulator, because remember, once we take it to the other branch, now it's not connected to high pressure from the shift block anymore, it has to get it from somewhere to hold the clutch out. That would be here. If I move the piston to this side, it closes it off to high pressure, and it opens it up to the return to the system and releases the pressure in the system. This piston here is connected to the brakes, so when I step on the brake, the pressure comes in here, it pushes this piston against this spring, which allows this rod to move to this direction, which you can see this is a cup that pushes this little spring against this cup, As this spring gets pressurized, it pulls this rod, which depressurizes this spring, which allows the hydraulic pressure to push this puck this way, which makes the valve have a greater tendency to push this way, which is a tendency to release, to engage the high pressure. So, now you've got the thing, you're stepping on the gas. This thing spins around with a little fan belt. These weights go out like that. As the weights go like that, they're going to compress this spring. As that spring compresses, it's going to allow the piston to move this way more easily because it's not pressing against that spring. It's going to open up the port to the return. The valve's going to turn to open, and it'll release the pressure in the center of the regulator, which is the first step in getting it out of the clutch sled. So that's basically it for that. So we're moving along here. Oops, the next one is the clutch lockout. This is really simple. We talked about that before. This is connected to the shift shaft in the top of the gearbox cover, which is, well, it's not on that. It's actually in the box, not the top cover. But as you can see right now, the ball is in this slot here, and the valve is open because the spring is pushing it open. If the rod were all the way over here, as if I were in a gear, the ball would also be in a low spot and the valve would be open. However, as I'm on the way from neutral to another gear, this little bump in the rod pushes the ball up, which pushes the valve up against the spring and closes off the port so no fluid can flow. So if I'm not completely in first or second gear, it won't let the pressure out of the clutch slave. The clutch will stay disengaged so I can't grind the gears. That's the purpose of that one. Where is that located? That's located on the side of the transmission on the right-hand side, right in front. This has two pipes in it because it's an AND valve. And it has an adjustment, it's got a couple of adjustments. There's a clamp around the shift fork rod, and there's a couple of slotted bolts. And the adjustment, we can talk about indexing at the end of the program. That's like extra credit I've got. Indexing is necessary if you take a component off the car and put it back. You can't just take it off and screw it back on because then the system won't work. So if you take this device off the gearbox and put it back, if you take the shift block out of the car and put it back, if you take the Reengagement control off the car and put it back, all those have to be indexed with locating pins before you can drive the car successfully. So we'll talk about that at the very end. So the final device, which is sort of the most complicated, and this is the heart of the system because what is unique and special about the DVH is that automatic clutch control. And the final step in releasing the pressure out of the clutch slave is the Reengagement control, so this is kind of the heart of how come it works. And it has several states, but first we'll talk about how it works. Here's the valve here, and there's two valves. There's this one is primarily a valve, this is not a valve, it's a piston. So this valve is a spool valve like all the other ones, but first I'm going to talk about this piston. What is this piston here for? Have you ever noticed when you're driving your Citromatic, you're in neutral and you've got a friend and you want to show them your engine, vroom, vroom, and you know what, it just won't go, you can't push down on the gas, it only revs to a certain level, and why is that? Well, that's because the chamber for this piston is connected through this little, dampening ball through here to high pressure. This high pressure comes in here. So whenever the car is in neutral, you have full pressure applied to the Reengagement control, and it pushes this piston out. This little cam-shaped thing here is connected to the accelerator pedal, and the arrow tells which way it rotates. So as you step on the gas, the little cam is going to rotate that way. At some point, the tip of the cam is going to contact that piston, which is now pushed out, and it won't go any farther. And I don't think there's any real reason why you need to not be able to rev your car up at idle, but there's another reason why this piston is here. And I calculatedly, when I talked about moving through the gears after you were driving, said, if you're upshifting. Well, what about if you're downshifting? If you've downshifted in manual transmission, you know that you put your foot in the clutch, you select the lower gear. Now, you can't just let the clutch out because the engine's going to go boom, so if you want to drive smoothly, you have to pre-calculate that and rev the engine up a little bit before you let the clutch out. In a VVH, you don't have to take your foot off the gas when you're downshifting. You just hold your foot on the gas, pop the lever in the next lower gear. As soon as you move it out of gear, the high pressure pushes the clutch slave out and simultaneously pushes this piston out, which actually you can feel it push your foot back on the accelerator as that piston comes out. And as soon as the clutch slave starts to release, it releases this pressure and allows your foot to go farther down, the revs come up, and you have a smooth downshift without ever having to take your foot off the gas. Just hold it down, push the lever, boom, it automatically downshifts. That's the purpose of that piston. So now, moving on to how this works, it's a little hard to tell. There's a pivot point here and a pivot point here. So this device pivots like this. This device pivots like this. And you can see that this device has got two springs on it, one on each side, and they balance it. They're pulling against each other. It's like if I pulled on your arm and you pulled on my arm, neither of us are going to move. But if I accelerate the car with the throttle, it's going to move this way, which is going to relax this spring, which is going to make this spring suddenly stronger, and it's going to tend to make this go this way, which is going to allow this piston to move this way, which is going to open the clutch slave to release pressure instead of to high pressure. So it's going to tend to release the clutch. So that's the basic concept of how it works. And this little guy here is a screw, and that's how you adjust the re-engagement rate manually from outside the engine. But how does it actually work? Well, that's what these 4 states are. It can achieve 4 states when it's going through its operation. In the first state, this first picture is when you're in neutral or between gears. It's all the same thing, remember. When you're in neutral, you've got high pressure coming in here, and remember the clutch slave is over here. The high pressure comes in here, and the force of the pressure does 2 things. It pushes this piston back against the thing, and it lets the pressure into this, where it is this chamber here, you see, is part of this chamber. So it lets the pressure go into the clutch slave with no restriction. I mean, there's no restriction there. It just immediately puts high pressure in the clutch slave, slams out, boom, we're in neutral. The second phase here, the second phase is, the other thing about hydraulics that I didn't mention is hydraulics don't happen instantly. In other words, it builds up pressure. It's kind of like filling up a water balloon or something. It fills up and fills up and fills up, but eventually it stops building up pressure. So if you try and pressurize something, you look at a gauge, the gauge goes up and then it stops. So initially, this is what it looks like, but the clutch slave is actuating in that phase. So the actuation of the clutch slave is using pressure, it's using volume, and so the pressure can't build up because it's still moving the clutch slave. At some point, the clutch slave stops. You can't go any farther. It reaches its stop. Now the pressure continues to build up. As the pressure builds up, it pushes, there's pressure against this piston pushing this way because the piston is free to slide. You've got pressure building up here. The pressure that builds up in the system when the clutch slave stops is pushing this piston against this lever and spring, and the increased pressure is causing this lever to move that way. And when that happens, it's still allowing free flow, but it's centering this system this way. Now in the third position, the centrifugal regulator has released its pressure, and we're starting in the first phase. Now remember, the first phase of engagement phase is you want the clutch to release quickly till you arrive at friction point. So this allows that to happen because the pressure has been holding this out and this here, and the pressure has really no restriction here. So the pressure is going to drop quite quickly. But as the pressure drops, this spring tension here is trying to push this back at the same time. So the pressure's dropping, but as soon as the pressure in the clutch slave drops to a certain point, which theoretically, if everything adjusted correctly, is the friction point, then this spring pressure is sufficient to push the piston back this way. As soon as the piston pushes back this way, it pushes this in here, and there's still pressure here, left residual pressure that's pushing this way. Now you can see that it is restricting the flow from the clutch slave, so the rate of disengagement rather slows down because you've restricted the orifice. Okay, so that's how the re-engagement control works. Like I said, it's going to be fast for some people and slow for other people. Okay, so now we move on to the adjustment theory part. We'll do a little more talking, then we actually go into touch the car. So adjustment theory. So the important thing is that everything is indexed and organized perfectly because it's a mechanical system. It doesn't, you have to tell it where to start and where to stop. And that's what the adjustments are all about. So the first thing we have to do is make sure our engine is tuned up and warmed up and running properly, because if it's not, the whole thing is ridiculous, because then as soon as you change something, all the adjustments are wrong again, because they're based on RPM and they're based on clutch clearance. So it's got to be tuned up, valves adjusted, whatever you need to do to make it run correctly. The first thing we do is you got to set the base idle, you got to set the accelerated idle, the clutch clearance, the rate, the threshold point is where the clutch centrifugal regulator begins to release, the accelerated idle speed, and then the last adjustment, the final adjustment, is the relationship of clutch release to throttle advance, which is taken care of with this. There's a little screw on the side right here, faces to the outside of the car. That's a driver. You decide. It's up to your temperament how you like to adjust that. If you like to do jackrabbit starts, you can set it to do that. If you're taking your grandmother out in the afternoon, you can set it to do that. That's the last thing. So, the first thing that we do, the most important adjustment, and the thing that I find that people are the least, the one that causes the most confusion, is adjusting the clutch clearance. And the reason that you need the clutch clearance and why it's so specific is we just talked about how the ideal here is that that initial release brings you right to friction point. Well, in order for that to work, this is a calculated situation here. The device moves the clutch fork a specific amount based on design in order to get to the friction point. It's your job to make sure the clutch is adjusted in such a way that when it moves at that specific amount, it actually ends up at the friction point and not somewhere else. That's the job.
Excuse me, so it's not feeling the pressure of it actually hitting the clutch?
No, it's purely a distance measurement. And that distance measurement is fixed in the design of the system. So it's your job to make sure the clutch adjustment is such that when it moves at that specific amount, you are actually at friction point when it thinks you are.
So it's not feeling it like
Doesn't feel it at all. Not like you on the foot. No, it's a calculated thing. So that adjustment makes it completely different than adjusting a manual clutch. A manual clutch, you just adjust it to a little free play, you're sure the bearing's not rubbing on the clutch, then you're good. On a Citromatic, what you do is completely different. You have to start somewhere. So what's your index point? Well, your index point is going to be the friction point, because that's where you want to end up. So the first thing you do is bring your clutch to the friction point, and then you advance it a specific amount. Now you've matched the clutch clearance to what the thing thinks it's going to be. So to perform the adjustment, which we'll do, I usually disable the central regulator so that the engine's not going around, but you don't have to. Well, actually you can, but not for the clutch adjustment. Sorry. Okay, so I have to start by assuming that the thing is correctly adjusted. So I turn the engine off, and I know it's a couple of turns out is the clearance that I want. So I turn it the other way 2 turns. Then I start the engine up, and I put the clutch crank in, the crank handle in. And if the friction point hasn't been reached yet, there's no pressure on the handle. If the friction point has been reached, the handle goes, you can't even put it in. So the object is to be able to stick the handle in and have a couple of pounds of pressure on it. The book shows a picture of a thing with a spring gauge on it. You go, oh, okay, it's 13.5, but you can just do it by feel. Now you know the clutch is right at the friction point. Now remember that I failed to say, the car is in neutral, so the clutch fork is fully disengaged as far as the logic system knows. It thinks the clutch is fully disengaged. You are manually bringing it from full disengagement to the friction point. Now you know where it is. Now you tighten the screw up 2 turns. Now everybody knows where it is. So when the thing releases, it releases at that specified amount, which works out to 2 turns. Now you're at the friction point. Now the rest of the system works well. So that's the most crucial adjustment in the system. Following that, turn it down to base idle, eliminate the accelerated idle. Make sure your base idle is within specification, and that's important. One of the things that I'm finding a lot is that as your carburetor wears, it starts bringing in excess air through the throttle shaft. Now your mixture's wrong. Well, I can fix your mixture. I can make your car idle smoothly by rejetting the carburetor, things like that, but in doing so, I'm going to raise the base idle speed. You're not going to be able to get it to idle low enough because there's simply too much air coming in. If you can't get it to idle below a certain point, I'm saying 800 is getting pretty high. What happens is when you do the centrifugal regulator adjustment, if you tighten the screw too much, I'll go back to that slide so I can show you what I'm talking about. Oh, there we go. This little screw on the front, which is this little screw here, controls the pressure of this inner spring, which acts in combination with these outer springs. The more spring tension there is, the more RPM it takes to move the weights out, and the higher RPM it is before the valve is allowed to slide to the release position. At some point, you're going to screw this little guy in so far that it compresses the spring up, and this valve won't be able to slide out far enough to ever disengage the clutch. And you'll screw that little thing in, and oh, I'm almost there, and all of a sudden nothing happens, the clutch will never engage and you can't drive the car. So the only way to fix that is to rebuild your carburetor so you can get the idle speed down low enough, because what we're looking for is base idle, about 100 RPM increase to release point, and then another 150 RPM on top of that to accelerated idle. If you don't have that sufficient RPM differential between base idle and release, you run the risk of dragging your clutch when you're sitting at the stop sign, and you don't want that to happen because it's really a pain to change your clutch in the DS. So let's see, we adjust the clutch clearance, we adjust the threshold at which the centrifugal regulator releases, then we readjust the accelerated idle so it's 150 above that threshold, and then we test drive the car and see how the relationship between clutch engagement and throttle is working for you, and you can turn that up and down. So that's basically the program for adjusting it. Now if there's any questions. Okay, well, you want to take a couple-minute break and then I'll actually show you how to do it on the car? How about that?